I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. What's happening? Benton here. Saturday morning, as recent as is the case recently, broadcasting from the back seat of a Nissan Versa. What's up, Rick? Parked on the streets of Los Angeles. And I will get to the topic, Benton and The Breakthrough. Hashtag cheer the level up. Meanwhile, there's a few things I'd like to discuss. And I hesitate to say the word Trump. I think Trump is a big problem. Saying, well, if Biden is president, it's like, well, Biden is doing this. Trump is doing that. Well, it's the government, right? It's the American government, the United States government doing these things. It's not Trump. It reminds me of, it's not Trump or Biden, I should say, depending on who's in the White House, or, Kamala or Hillary or any of these characters. It's the government doing these things. And I feel myself getting a little worked up this morning. So your patience is appreciated, because certainly Benton will certainly be putting some effort into remaining properly identified, which may slow down the discourse to some extent. And these are natural, natural, within the context of human experience. This is normal and expected, to be in a cranky or sort of an edgy mood at times. And I know what's going on. Benton understands what's happening. And, as far as the third person side of things, many will find that annoying and arrogant and all of these things. And it is something that I, Benton, the performer here, in the context of the performance, I've been doing versions of that most of my life, as far as I know. But Benton is finding it helpful because of the introduction of the what I am, or the I am, and the I and the AM both being capitalized, in some way representing, divinity, or the Most High, or so-called God, right? So-called God. And there may be more pauses than normal as well. Perhaps the style of the broadcaster will be changing. We shall see. And that comes along with the breakthrough. Oh yes, back to the third person, going third person. What I would request or hope for, or trust that could happen, would be that folks would, accept and adjust, and that itself can be a spiritual practice. So if a person reacts with irritation and annoyance to a phenomenon such as Benton going third person, that is an opportunity. Number one, it's meditation. That is meditation, in the moment, to become aware of the feelings of irritation and annoyance. That is meditation. And what I would further, I hesitate to say advise. My experience of meditation is that for the beginner to intermediate practitioner of meditation, then the moment the individual is aware of the feelings of irritation and annoyance, it's to observe those feelings without identifying with the feelings themselves. Interesting. Yes. And to not allow oneself to be carried away with those feelings, but to simultaneously not repress. See, this is the dual nature of this, or the binary, is repression is always harmful to the individual. And Benton found in previous versions of Benton, seemingly in the short term, quite effective to repress. And that does seem to be what many, if not most, individuals default to, is repression. So the key for meditation is to be willing to sit with those uncomfortable feelings and observe, passively. And and then we get into more, again, spiritual surrender, yin energies, acceptance. And that's what Benton is practicing this morning, um, within his energy sphere, within his emotions, um, all of these various systems occurring within delusion, right? Not certainly in a waking dream, surrealistic, unreal way, by definition. And it's good that I'm being challenged in this way, and I will get into specifics. But some of this is a philosophical, or a spiritual, or a religious notion of, being thankful or grateful for, anyone or anything that is able to function as an enemy. And while Benton, the collection of experiences, the biography, the timeline of events, uh, you know, in this realm, I tend not to go quite that far with it, to be actually grateful and thankful. However, um, I certainly view it as an opportunity to to level up again, to continue to level up um, abilities. And that all comes back to effectiveness in the real world. And I myself have had a near fanatical obsession with, and this is a bit hyperbolic. It's not quite this, but what could seem like an obsession with effectiveness. However, other people don't typically notice it, because most folks are not running, all of these analyses and pattern recognition, and most folks simply are not that observant. Although, um, not necessarily unobservant. And then we get into the psychological makeup and the conscious awareness of the so-called normie, the NPC, or the masses. And how many years now those of us who've been interested in so-called conspiracy theories and rabbit holes for you know perhaps over a decade, or how, whatever that time period has been. Certainly at some point, documentaries and various content has been consumed around the notion of the sleeping masses, or the sheeple, um, effectively not aware, not realistically operating at a level of independent thought, critical thought, no longer processing data. Um, Ideas are packaged and then sent to these individuals via push notification. And if I begin to speak of individual um, uh, content creators, or audience members, or users within this, user might be an appropriate term, user within the context of a so-called truth community, a panel verse, and all of this. And at this point, and a lot of this morning, Benton, with my own practices. Let's try. I think my is okay. Again, what I'm attempting to avoid is inappropriately saying I am, which would be to curse one's own blessing in a way. To say, the I am and then anything negative, if that makes sense. So eventually, the royal we, I like the royal we will figure this out uh, and perfect these practices, certainly, and perfect this path and these paths. Um, and again, the overarching theme for Benton here, it's always coming back to effectiveness. What can be effectuated? Is that the right term? What can be brought forth, tangibly and demonstrated. Because when effectiveness is discussed, a demonstration or concrete proof is necessary. And this is where Benton, in the context of the performance, has diverged from the vast majority of humanity, at least with respect to what I have experienced, right? And apologies for the back and forth between the Benton, the I, the me, the royal we. I can see now that this is going to be a process of me teaching myself which term is appropriate and not appropriate. And I certainly relate to this has to be frustrating and annoying on some level. So my profuse apologies, and thank you for your patience and your willingness to listen. It does mean a lot, truly, to be heard. And it is healing on some level. When one actively listens to another, now it's can be or generally speaking would be much more healing and valuable in the public space, especially within somewhat close proximity, energy sphere overlapping energy sphere and exchanging energies. But I would expect even via the internet, something about the, maybe the fact that once the voice goes into the Borg here, once my living voice, right, as the sound vibrations, leave my mouth, that's a living thing, right? At least within the context of delusion, in this place. And, then we get into concepts of like word of God type stuff, which can never mean written scripture. And maybe this is part of the reason why folks are more attracted to the live stream as it happens than even with the delay. There's a few second delay. Maybe this is why the live material is more appealing, perhaps. And I don't have the IQ or the knowledge to answer, well, what is done to that energy form when it's digitized and then zeros and ones apparently flow through the internet into these devices. Well, I don't know. So the royal we will take what we can get at this point. And I made it, it's hard to say an error, because if, this philosophy of being grateful for one's enemy or the opportunity that is potentially provided by an enemy, well, remember, when properly identified, what I am doesn't make enemies. However, the realm makes an enemy of what I am. In fact, it exists to make an enemy of what I am. Okay. Which in some way is the most arrogant thing possible, if for one to believe that, right, and to assert that. And that's true when only directed at the performer, right, within the context of the performance, within the context of delusion. When I'm speaking to the what I am, which is the most super intelligent force of love and creation, powerfully, right, a quickening spirit, the most super intelligent force of love and creation possible at the highest levels of vibrational frequency, a quickening spirit. And I'm not saying that Benton, the personality, is that. I'm saying that my essence, soul, whatever it's being referred to, that's what, at my core essence, I am one with that. And that is beyond time and space. And in fact, again, delusory notions of time and space and place and location and along a progression and all of these things is, again, accessible only via delusion, which then in my world, and perhaps that is the reason, part of the reason for the biblical story of an earthly, heaven, Jesus coming to earth, divine and fully man, and in the story, in the story of the Bible, perhaps that's why it's acknowledging the delusory nature of the realm, and that's the reason for, although Benton, right, the royal we was unaware of the reasons initially for all of the Book of Job talk, which apparently is something I'm have been and continue to be excoriated for referring to the Book of Job, because apparently, and I certainly don't claim to have brushed up on the Book of Job anytime recently. So have I read the Book of Job in my life? Absolutely. Has it been a long fucking time? Absolutely. Have I read the Book of Job repeatedly over the last however many years? Yes, I have. Have any of those rereadings been recently? No, not really. So coming from memory, in observing my own discourses in real time, I have not, I haven't found any error. And remember, the 24/7 analysis going on in my brain, along with the pattern recognition, is always expending energies on the lookout for these things, right? And not to confer any form of infallibility. It's absolutely possible that I have that Benton has made himself to appear foolish with the Book of Job talk. However, Benton doubts it, and in fact, Benton would assert that any notions around the Book of Job or Job chapter 1, any thing that doesn't really, seemingly line up fully with, well, let's bottom line this, in order for me to be accused, mocked, ridiculed, and for any of that to have any validity whatsoever, at the potential lack of my own study, research, and knowledge. I mean, that's what this is. It's the ridiculing and mockery of someone who has the audacity to go live so frequently and speak extemporaneously, off the dome, right, at length. The sheer audacity of such an undertaking. But where is the mockery? This is what I would challenge, and this is not how logic works. This is like just a rhetorical question, food for thought. This is not me making an argument. So in a debate, both sides at some points they're going to be making their own they're going to be asserting. Each side will assert their own argument, right? To rhetorically ask a question does not represent an assertion of an argument. But so where I would start in the formulation of an argument, were I to do so, would be to ask myself, okay, does this apply across the board? Because the individuals presumably directing the mockery and ridicule, is this something, and this gets to motivation, and this gets to the nature of, well, who or what are these individuals identified with, and for what purposes? Okay. And especially if some of these individuals' actions over time represent an enemy, right? Something that would make me its enemy. And I also want to point out real quick that Benton is certainly aware, as Benton listens to his own discourse here, the Royal We's discourse, that the pattern recognition and the observances is picking up key points in this discourse that would align with cult-like activities or behaviors. And how do I know this? It's because through seemingly no fault of my own, I was raised in an actual mind control cult. A formal practice of mind control was conducted upon me from a very early age by a cult, right? So yeah, I see the dynamics there in the discourse. And part of the leveling up, the breakthrough is, and then early on, and this is, serendipitous, right? And also gets into notions of everything happens for a reason, which I'm not a huge fan of that. Um, that for more like everything always works out probably makes a little more sense. But in fact, Benton's past experiences with this specific upbringing arguably would preclude Benton from ever, number one, joining a cult, which is quite helpful, and then number two, um, uh, starting one or attracting adherents to something that would then morph into a cult. Okay. Um, which absolutely is possible, except it's not possible, thankfully. Um, and I saw early on through the Jehovah's Witnesses that, the main problem, if one is in a degenerated state enough to, still be desirous of praise and worship and, all of these things as a cult leader, or, you know, equally as bad joining a cult in order to have one's, fears and uncertainties and whatever the person is going on, whatever is going on within an individual with their own insecurities. People like my parents when they were 19 or 20 years old, and were preyed upon by the Jehovah's Witness cult. And it was predatory, certainly, indubitably predatory. And so I just happened to go to another channel in the so-called truth community and just kind of clicked around to a few points, in a long live stream, and a clip was being covered by what sounded like a black fella. And remember, I'm almost always listening. And apparently, through the wonders of the internet, presumably this gentleman had managed to find several people who, desired to be financially dominated or whatever this is. And, they've apparently gone to live with this guy. Again, I wasn't watching, I was only listening. And, he's on the internet bragging about how, he's asking each of these, his slaves, right, his followers, how much money they gave him and all of this. And then he's sort of, jeering at the audience and saying, well, you folks could never do this. You couldn't have people giving you all this money. Meanwhile, I'm listening to all of this and my only thought is, well, absolutely. I understand that this is what this fellow's doing. And some people can do this. Some people can't do this. However, simply based on, an ability existing within the individual, maybe at the level of talent and ability, that doesn't, that in no way, validates the, whether the idea has merit or is a good thing, simply because there's talent that can be taken advantage of. Now, what I would say is within the context of the vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions, and in American society, where society only measures in money and power, right, but mostly in money. And then with the Mark Passio notions, which I'm sure aren't his notions, but the notions I learned from Mark Passio, and again, abstractly, not needing to relate to Mark Passio, the individual, not needing to point out that he had become a vegan and soy boy and all of this. That's completely unnecessary. I'm speaking of the ideas, the idea being that society is either free or enslaved in, direct relation to the, morality of the people collectively, averaged out more or less, the collective performance of society at the level of morality. So what we're talking about is someone who is publicly, showing, using these people immorally, and because it's tied to money, well, it's, some folks will be jealous. Some folks will say, how can I do that? Some folks will say, how repulsive, this is evil, what's going on here, right? And then, of course, many people will say, well, you can't judge, and these are consenting adults, and and it seems like they knew what they were signing up for. And when Benton watches this, he says, well, yeah, I understand what's happening here. The problem for the cult leader is that in exchange for all of this money, he spends virtually all of his time around the type of people who would join such a movement or organization and turn over all of their, wealth and worldly possessions and money to this fellow to then blindly lead and do as they're told. And probably, I'm assuming these individuals are most likely under some form of demonic influence, wicked spirits, unclean spirits, demonic spirits. Most likely, I'm assuming. And so I view the situation not as, wow, I could make somebody. I view it as, oh, well, if not for this pesky morality. Well, number one, it's actually, there's no way I would spend my time, the bulk of my time around these type of people. And in fact, again, shout out to the Jehovah's Witnesses in that regard. I grew up around a bunch of folks who would join some version of that. Now, not the children, not the people born into it necessarily, but my parents, I spent a lot of time with them, and they were the type of people who would join, some flavor of a cult, not necessarily that one, And my parents signed up to be told what to do by an authoritarian religion. My parents did that. And, I no longer view this as something that was done to me, right? And many years, the royal we spent dealing with and clearing, and removing and deprogramming and removing the coding. And some of it still persists to this day. And I guess that by what I've been talking about on this broadcast, is it appropriate to be thankful that happened? Well, again, what I am, is only grateful and is only thankful, right? It lacks the ability to be otherwise, seemingly, right? It lacks the ability to put its energies into the negative sides of all of that. And, for a long ass time, if I ran into the Jehovah's Witnesses, while just they were in a park or something trying to proselytize, or, they would come up to me in the laundromat or whatever, it certainly would, I would find feelings of anger stirred up. And that's no longer the case, right? And there was a period of time when I wanted to try to, talk to them to sort of just let them know that they're under mind control. Well, when a mind control victim is told that they're under mind control, the only result that ever occurs is they double down on whatever content was used, whatever the content of the mind control is. That's doubled down upon. And again, I have, Benton, the royal we here, has had experiences that just, most of the rest of you will never be able to relate to, such as walking into a convention center, I believe in Memphis, Tennessee, with my family. We were all dressed in our Sunday best, carrying book bags, going to join several thousand other Jehovah's Witnesses in the arena. This was pre-pyramid. I don't know where this would have been, but I guess just the convention center in Memphis. And it would not have had to be Memphis, but probably Memphis. And I still remember there was, doors, glass doors. So like two sets of double doors. And so on the left side of all of that and the right side of all of that were two people with poster board with anti-Jehovah's Witnesses messages written on them. And presumably these people believed that they were attempting to assist in helping the cult members realize that they are under mind control. And my experience of that was my family and myself included, to some degree, commenting on what the fuck is wrong with these crazy people, right? As I thought about and observed, my own reactions to that situation, and I would have been, I don't know, no older than 12 years old from my memory, that in fact, that was the doubling down on the pre-existing beliefs. In fact, the cult programming, that's a function of the mind control, is to prepare the way for when, notions to the contrary are presented, if that makes sense. so that the reaction, that when the stimulus occurs, as it necessarily will, the mind controlled individual immediately responds to the stimulus and response. Knee jerk, some version of a knee jerk reaction. So then back to, and it is persecution. Let's call persecution what it is. To be spiritually attacked, right? Now I'm back to some of these other folks in the so-called truth community, and I would say virtually everyone I'm referring to has been, a part of this channel in various ways, and a part of my life in various ways, to some extent. And I don't view this as jealousy. I'm not viewing this as, oh, I've broken through and they haven't, so they're jealous. Well, realistically, these folks are not working towards something at the level of effectiveness that could lead to breakthrough, spiritual breakthrough, right? And via the transcendence of the present limitations. And then to repeatedly over a period of many years, and this is not necessarily what's required. What I'm speaking of was what was required for Benton. For other folks, it's going to always look different. It's going to be discrete to that individual, again, within the context of delusion, within the context of this realm existing seemingly solely to make an enemy of what I am. Okay. And and I have further points I'd like to make later. If I try to make all of them simultaneously, the royal we are not going to get anywhere. So thank you for your patience. Much obliged. Hit that like if you would. I would appreciate that. Oh, man. And then also, some of what I'm going to be speaking on here is tied into my own out of necessity, because I simply refuse to repress any of my own emotional reactions to spiritual attacks. And that's what this is. And, when I look back at some of my own past behaviors with the panel verse, the so-called truth community, have some of my actions represented spiritual attacks? Well, if the individual was, practicing and some version of self-improvement, or, evolving their conscious awareness, which I would say is probably just about everybody. This is where I'm optimistic with the transcendent potential of an individual. I would say virtually all of the individuals are doing their own versions of that, to a lesser or a greater extent. And then probably, I don't want to speculate, but then when I get into notions of breakthrough, and that's certainly what this true knowledge of self, unlocking the achievement within the last 6 months of true knowledge of self / self-realization by yours truly, with assistance, of course. This is not something that, Benton the performer, Benton the worldly parts of the consciousness certainly did not perform, it doesn't get to take full credit. It's the what I am that gets the credit, right? Benton certainly gets credit for his, obstinance, persistence, bullheadedness, stubbornness, courage, right? Courage to courageously and tenaciously set goals and then go after them. Okay. How could the credit for that accrue to anything else, right? Now, the credit for it being possible and for the assistance and the guidance and being taught by the Comforter, again, which is the Holy Ghost, which what I am will send in the name of Christ consciousness, as Benton continues to interpret the Holy Bible in the English language, the King James Version in the English language, in real time within himself, and will never allow any externalities, anything external to Benton's energy sphere will be permitted to dissuade Benton from that. Okay. And in fact, what anybody else thinks about it, it's instructive observing people's reactions to this breakthrough. And it reminds me of when an artist, right, breaks through. Jackson Pollock, perhaps. And I would go ahead and say to anyone who's heard of Jackson Pollock and has any notion of his art, well, what will regularly come to mind is, again, at the level of stimulus and response, is notions around mockery and ridicule of an artist who within a medium broke through such that future art, future visual art, was now forever changed as a result of what would be inspired, right? Just by the mere fact of a new style or a new school or a new way of looking at visual art, a breakthrough, right? Jackson Pollock. And I do personally like a lot of Jackson Pollock's paintings. And that was, if anybody's unaware, well, Google it, or just a lot of it was the paint drippings onto canvas. Of course, a lot of which have actual paintings underneath them. And then and what I mean by actual paintings is a painting of something that could actually, have some sort of a coherent form, a non-abstract coherent form, rather. Because I don't want to imply that the abstract form would necessarily lack coherence. I don't want to imply that. And then, interestingly, again, am I able to recall something I've read? I remember, I have a memory of reading that Pollock, or actually hearing on a documentary, that Pollock would meditate for like 2 weeks before actually making the painting. So this is certainly some fusion of mind, body, and spirit. And then the techniques used to make the large canvas paintings, that's again, mind, body, and spirit. There is some physicality there. And then just the idea of mockery and ridicule, and then also how Pollock was received, in the time after the breakthrough, which, again, going from memory, seemingly much of the art world, their first reaction was to deny that this happened at all, and to discuss and make it seem like, well, in fact, this was not a breakthrough. And then when it was, begrudgingly accepted, okay, well, this is some sort of creative breakthrough, then to seek to minimize, and again, the mockery and the ridicule that gets attached to that name. Well, what is that? Like, why is that happening? Well, that's the idea of crabs in a bucket, or so-called tallest lily syndrome. And I know implicitly that the mockery and ridicule directed presumably my way. It's not made explicit that it's directed my way. And again, presumably some of this mockery and ridicule is directed toward yours truly. However, Benton has also detected, certain personality traits where it's easy for me to hear someone talking and assume that they're talking about me. That I have a propensity to do that, and I've taught myself over time to kind of be watchful for that. But then there are times when, maybe when not at his best, Benton does revert to just, if someone is talking about a third party, I think they're talking about me, right? So saying all of this, realizing it's certainly possible that none of this was meant for me, but as talked about on this channel, in some way, all of your comments and live chats are directed at me, whether they are or not. And in some way, if I go watch another channel and the topics are pertaining to me, well, in some way, from my perspective, from Benton's perspective, that is directed at me, whether it may be, again, overtly or explicitly or not. And there's certainly some potential for confusion in there, certainly. What's going on with my video here? Okay, had the wrong camera on. And I guess I'm boring the shit out of everybody now, so I see the numbers. I think we peaked out around 15, now we're down to 6, although you never know, maybe the content creator I'm attempting to refer to without mentioning the name, the channel is at In a Thought Experiment, right? It's not my style to pussyfoot and beat around the bush quite so much. And I do want to point out, no animosity, no ill will. I've detected no animosity or ill will directed at me on a human level from the content creator of that channel. My assumption is that whatever positive regard has existed for yours truly continues to exist. And I know that I'm difficult to deal with and get along with in the long run. Like, I'm certainly aware of that. And, famously, I've said in the past, well, I'm able to get along with anyone who can get along with me. And that is some acknowledgement that I know I'm fucking hard to deal with. And in part of that, let's get to love thy neighbor as thyself, which is not a perfect technology. And that has problems, because how I may want to be treated and how you or another person may want to be treated could be very different things. So if I'm treating another individual the way I would want to be treated, well, that doesn't represent how they might want to be treated. Isn't that interesting? So, treating people the way I would want to be treated. Whatever it was I just described, I've already forgotten it, but it's already been said, thankfully. Maybe at some point, I could have a phone just listening to what I'm saying, or a tablet, and, have a transcript where I could just look up and see, the last 60 seconds of what I've spoken, perhaps. That could be beneficial. That visual cue of what in the world I'm on about. And again, recalling that what I am cannot create resistance. Okay, meaning what I am is not able to watch part of a live stream, come to understand that some of this is probably directed at Benton, and that actually, while this was being said on a live stream, apparently both content creators yesterday were live simultaneously. And in the course of my live stream, after being told that this other content creator was live, I predicted the possibility of mockery and ridicule being directed towards yours truly. And surprise, surprise, when I listened to a few moments of the live stream, that appears to have been the case. Well, again, what I am is not capable of being offended by that. What I am is not able to experience friction or resistance or, ill will at those levels. Right. And I forget now why I mentioned love thy neighbor as thyself, but I did want to work in to the Christians who listen. And I know there's some Christians that listen to this, some churchgoers who mention, who listen to this channel rather. And, maybe it's some black pill, maybe for them it's some black pill version, as I continue to like slice and dice, the lack of authority and the invalidity of the man-made religion known as Christianity, the gospel of Paul, as it were. But what I'm interested in is the gospel of Jesus, right? So the idea of love thy neighbor as thyself, and love the Lord thy God with all one's heart, shall be the whole of the law, right? And as far as I can tell, Benton is living that to a much greater extent than he's not living that. Again, back to the as yet, not as yet able to in each new moment be properly identified with what I am, my own true essence or nature. Because make no mistake, when properly identified within myself, that is spiritual perfection, folks. Now, nobody's saying Benton is a spiritually perfect being. Benton is referring to John 14:26, talking about the Comforter and bringing and teaching all things and bringing unto remembrance, and knowing, because of the Comforter or the Holy Ghost's assistance in interpreting Scripture, knowing that the remembrance means to recall the spiritual perfection the being was in when the being incarnated into this delusory realm. And I don't even know that incarnate is even the proper term. But, again, at least within the context of delusion, the realm existing as a vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions. And my contention is that idea must be reconciled. And part of what happens to Benton when Benton falls away from that spiritually perfected proper identification is that identified with anything else, Benton falls into his, neurodivergent, potentially, undiagnosed fake autistic thing where Benton is offended, not at the level of people and personalities and being not bullied, but being picked at and hazed, right? Because I've gone through a lot of that in my life, not the bullying side, but certainly the being picked at, cajoled, harassed, harangued, trolled, made sport of, gaslit. And in fact, probably everybody listening has experienced that. Okay. Yeah. So when improperly identified, Benton knows that the reason is because at the level of effectiveness and thinking and logic and reason, as soon as the mockery and the ridicule shows up, well, when improperly identified, that shit does bother me. And it definitely represents a spiritual attack. Again, the thing I'm supposed to be grateful for, right? Well, as much as I do have an ability to self-flagellate, it's not really what I'm about overall, right? That's more of a means and a mechanism at times. That's not altogether unpleasant from my perspective, if that makes sense. And that does speak to some notions of asceticism, right? I mean actual asceticism, not. I typed in asceticism into YouTube, and it's now asceticism on YouTube LARPs is something other than what it actually is, unsurprisingly. Yes. And ultimately, within the context of delusion and all of these things I'm discussing, back to the reconciliation. So back to the idea of logic and reason and discussion and discourse and these ideas must be reconciled. If Benton is plausibly able to describe this realm as vacuous, delusory, adversarial, and almost entirely comprised of business and financial transactions, as far as the foundation upon which almost all human endeavor occurs in America. There's virtually nothing that your typical American, it's very typical for an American to wake up in the morning and then 90+% of everything they do that day is engaged in the vagaries of serving a system of business and transactions. I don't believe that to be debatable. And, I know what I know. However, if there was to be a formal debate, I'm almost certain which side would win in the debate, given both debaters of equal skill, because certainly a skilled debater can out-debate a less skilled debater, even with a weaker position, right? Strategically, this is possible. Certainly. So that must be reconciled in order to continue to participate in the discourse. And I personally, when you get back to the book of Job and then Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk, so why was I able to speak? So around the time I was so frequently mentioning, and I do want to be clear that if we go to the tapes and the transcripts, initially Job chapter 1 was singled out when Book of Job was mentioned, and then that got shortened to Book of Job. Book of Job, right? Yeah. And, I even detected that my own accent and way of speaking was being mocked to some extent, although that may not have been the case because I did not stick around long enough to fully understand exactly what was happening. Perhaps that's me being too sensitive. And all I would say about anybody that wants to mock the Southern accent, that's fine. Just speed it up a little bit if you would. Uh, yeah, many Southerners speak slowly. Where I'm from, we don't. We don't speak slowly. So just an increase in the cadence is really all I would ask when mocking or making fun of the accent. It's like, why are people mocking my accent, but they're slowing down the way I don't talk like that. Uh, um, in fact, one of the few accurate imitations I've ever heard of an Arkansas accent was the guy from Portlandia. What's that guy's name? Fred Armisen. And he went on like Conan O'Brien and claimed to be able to do like more or less all of the regional Southern accents. And when he got to Arkansas, he referred to it as percussive, and also you could tell that he was intentionally had a cadence and a rhythm to it, like in a pace, right? It's not Savannah, Georgia, or somewhere in North Carolina or whatever, right? Which I find interesting. But then again, back to the mockery and ridicule. Well, I know that has significance. And if we look at a game of incomplete information such as poker, and this is where we get into notions where specific users, some of which used to be part of this channel, or one in particular that used to be a part of this channel, and is certainly welcome to return in some capacity. Um, Again, no ill will, no hard feelings. And Benton doesn't hold a grudge. However, um, when Benton is speaking of, having deduced, certain, and then, making educated guesses about what might be the motivations of another person, and then, Benton being gaslit in some way and saying, well, how could you possibly ever know these things about these other people and what's going on with them? Well, it's called being observant. It's called tracking of details over time. It's called intuition. Okay. It's called pattern recognition. And then that all intersects with deductive reasoning, right? Logic and reason. Okay. And also reconciliation. And this is where I would challenge a lot of the folks who might, want to mix it up with me is, some of them simply will never rise to that level to even be able to do all of those things. It's sort of like when a teacher has a class of students and the teacher assigns a book and says, hey, read this book and write a book report. Well, the teacher knows from experience some number of these students are not going to read the book. Now, some of the ones who don't read the book are going to write the book report, and then some of them are actually probably going to read parts or all of the book and then not write the book report. And then, a lot of them are going to do neither. They're not going to read the book and they're not going to write the book report. Right. Or they're going to just try to get, some fake, they're going to try to, copy off of somebody else's notes or whatever. And that's what's here. That's what's going on here. The fact that I have done, am doing, and am fully committed to continuing to do all of what I just described and more, well, and Benton, within my own energy sphere, serving as student and then student teacher, perhaps, if the comforter of the Holy Ghost is what's teaching, then, I can be the student and I guess like some version of a grad assistant, right? And, understanding and here's the spiritual surrender side is, just the tacit acceptance that many, if not most of the individuals are simply never going to do all of these things to, again, level up or rise to a comparable level. Now, some people have already done all of that and continue to do it in their own way. So then that brings me to why the resistance to how the book of Job has been referred to, and specifically Job chapter 1. And I definitely put my name on the Job chapter 1 part. Now, if something happens in the story of Job later on that seemingly contradicts what I've asserted vis-a-vis Job chapter 1, that is not Benton's concern, okay? Because again, Benton at no point agreed to swallow the dead scripture of the Holy Bible, the King James Version of the Holy Bible in the English language. I never agreed to swallow that and then engage in dogma and doctrine, other than the dogma and doctrine, which isn't even the appropriate term, but only as operates within Benton's own sphere of influence or energy sphere internally, not externally, if that makes sense. And there is no church, right? There is no Christian religion without externalities. And that's, in my view, the major weapon, one of the major weapons of antithesis or the enemy or Satan, is to direct individuals' efforts and energies and focus outwardly or externally to their own source of power, right? Which is always internal to them if they are what I am. If we in fact are the same thing, and some silly notion of we are all one at the highest level, right? Notions of this. Hey, prove it. That's at this point. I'm like, hey, prove it. You got to show me, Jack. So that I recognize that, whatever I may viscerally react to when falling away from proper identification, where these spiritual attacks do temporarily bear fruit or temporarily find a foothold, and don't prosper, but perhaps, begin moving towards prosperity under the notion of no weapon formed against what I am shall prosper, right? Well, Benton was improperly identified, and that's what even allowed the spiritual attacks to potentially have any effect whatsoever in the first place. And that's part of Benton talking all of this through, is to, again, avoid any repression of any negative states that may result from not the attacks, from interfacing with the attacks in the context of improper identification. See this distinction that's being made? So the distinction I'm interested in is why so much energy put into the mockery and ridicule of how Benton has chosen to speak about the book of Job, when Benton also chose to speak about Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk and made a bunch of great points, presumably, and was even Benton was even another content creator, a respected content creator that I respect greatly, said, hey, that was an awesome bit about Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk. And I don't expect that praise. Benton doesn't expect that praise. Benton also does not expect to be praised for abstracting certain concepts from Job chapter 1 and making larger points, and simultaneously being taught by the Holy Ghost, right? Now, does the Holy Ghost and does Christ exist for the religion, right? See, this is where we get into cart before the horse, or an inversion. What is the purpose of these things, right? Or is the religion, if I was to just give the religion, and say, well, it has proper intentions, which it doesn't, but if the religion, was of a proper intention, right, as much as a religion, a dead thing, can have an intention, right? But whatever the function it's serving, the religion itself. And then why must that be so vociferously and voraciously defended, right? Whereas Jack, from the story Jack and the Beanstalk, well, there's no reason to defend that. See, so now we get back to the idea of a poker game of incomplete information. We get into deductive reasoning. So this all means something. The mockery and the ridicule is representative of something, right? And then the not being mocked and ridiculed for speaking about Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk, but being made sport of for a particular approach to Job chapter 1, right, from the book of Job, okay, and then almost immediately being spiritually attacked around notions of, well, you need to read the entire book, and every word that came out of Benton's mouth must be reconciled with every other word from the entirety of the book of Job. Absolutely not. Not when the abstract layer is accessed. Absolutely not. If I had enough knowledge of the Quran, I might have thrown in some Quranic ideas, right? Benton here is not limiting himself unless, and that's where effectiveness comes in. Benton refuses to limit himself. Again, show me a human, I'll show you a hypocrite. That includes me. I'm sure there's always exceptions to everything. I'm sure I've run afoul of this, but overall, right, it's going to come back to effectiveness. Bottom line, how does this affect Benton's ability to be effective in the air quotes real world, or effective in performance within delusion, more correctly? How does this happen? And I simply observe, Benton is able to observe, the royal we observes that few, if any, other individuals are performing what I'm now describing in excruciating detail, right? And again, I've talked before about how what I speak on these streams represents perhaps 10% of my understanding or my comprehension or what I know, being limited within this experience in that way. And the just, again, inherent, the limitations of the language itself, right? And then also recognizing that when individuals, having studied mockery and ridicule as a weapon so much, recognizing at a certain point that, almost not everything, but almost everything I do or say at a certain point becomes fodder for mockery and ridicule. And subjecting myself to so much mockery and ridicule over time through the old chalk body outline discord, at a certain point I recognize, okay, certain individuals are going to greet me with mockery and ridicule, irrespective of what it is that I choose to do, what it is that I choose to say, which side of a particular, topic I fall on, no matter what. Now, there is some version of, at a social contract, if I did just completely go along with a specific notion of worship or Christianity or dogma or doctrine, then again, because recall, see acceptance is being withheld. And this, to me, it's one of the key points, perhaps the key point. These individuals that I'm referring to, in being so strongly identified with the authority and validity of this realm, right, and rejecting, certain descriptors of the nature of this place, or the essence of this place, or how this place exists and functions, within the rejection of all of that. Why is mockery and ridicule used? Well, and some of that is, as we know, as the royal we knows, it appeals to the fickle feelings of the peanut gallery, which is, again, representative of nothing whatsoever. So when I'm improperly identified, what I feel is that agitation and irritation is around seeing people interface with ideas in such a way that is ineffective. It's just simply ineffective in the long run, depending on, in the context of critical thinking, deductive reasoning, reconciliation of ideas, and moving the discourse forward. And that's how I've gotten to recently claiming that my discourse represents the highest level thinking, right? I didn't say highest level discourse, highest level thinking in the, so-called, in whatever this tiny little corner of the internet is. And Benton puts his name on that. Now, if somebody else, and now in order to, now here's also another key point. In a competitive vein of someone saying, oh, okay, well, challenge accepted. If there was somebody or persons who said, okay, well, Benton is out here, sort of on the, the playing field, showing his stuff and claiming to be number one in the quality of his thinking. If other people were to involve themselves with the same endeavor, it's not for them to take my thinking and move it forward. It's for them to take their own thinking, whatever they're able to glean from what I've discoursed based on my own thinking, and then to combine that with their own observances, their own experiences, whatever books they've read, whatever research they've done, and then for them to demonstrate over time an equal or greater level of thinking. And I'm here to tell you it has not happened. Now, that's my observances. That's what I know. Now, again, it's a matter of opinion. Once it leaves the energy sphere and goes external, away from me, well, then it becomes a matter of opinion. Okay, and other people can have their own opinions. Benton here is the royal we is quite confident in this, and a lot of that comes down to living life, if that's even the appropriate term, but it's to choose for something like 15 years now through Benton's own choices that have led to certain things about Benton that people find mockable or worthy of ridicule. Well, some of that comes along with choosing to live in such a way to put a great emphasis on how often during a given day does Benton have to devote to thinking, and part of which was, that's part of it was why long haul truck driving at times has been such a great way for Benton to have earned money, was that Benton was able to, the royal we were able to do a great deal of thinking. Very beneficial. Very beneficial. Other folks so closely identified with the potential, well, again, based on the false notion of authority or validity existing whatsoever in this vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions. This delusory realm has no authority or validity. Okay. Now, what would it be if enough individuals morally conducted themselves, based on this Mark Passio notion of, society is this highly enslaved because of how immoral society has become. And what Mark Passio has contended is that if society became moral, then it would be, less enslaved, or I can't say more free. It would be less enslaved along a progression, which, that makes total sense to me. Absolutely. And that's more and more I'm seeing that, just how wicked and immoral, not abstract people, not imaginary people. No, every discrete individual, if that's in fact what they are, who in every moment that individual is not properly identified within themselves with their own true nature, if they are what I am and what I know myself to be at my core essence or soul, they lack the ability to be moral people, just as Benton lacked the ability to be a moral person overall. What I'm meaning, in taking a true account, or like a ledger, if a person such as the older versions of Benton, after practicing meditation, becoming at least an intermediate level practitioner of meditation, at a certain point, introspectively, at a level of never bullshit yourself. So via the practice in part of never bullshit yourself, combined with meditation and introspection, courageously, regardless of how disorienting, how painful it was, coming to the reality many years ago that, I assumed, like virtually everybody else does, that I was a good person, even as I was doing and having bad thoughts and taking bad actions and immoral actions, or less than moral actions even, right? And then understanding in that moment, okay, well, now I have the power. I'm not a victim of this. I have a power to then change my ways and create a being who's at least a good person. And my initial view of that was, once I crossed the 50% line of, at least half of my thoughts and actions are not immoral, then eventually getting up to somewhere around 75%, I would say, okay, that constitutes a good person, and then was able to achieve that, in my own estimation quite early on. But then now we still have some incorrect action during the 25%, of course. And then that's some version of a fake it till you make it. That's what I would say about the Bible and following the teachings of Christ, and then the idea of these layered parables, right? Well, when the individual begins to practice certain things, and one of those could be, give us this day our daily bread, right? That would be for like a very basic level practitioner, the so-called Lord's Prayer, right? And that's the basic level practitioner saying, hey, how do we pray? Because we're so basic, we don't know how to pray, right? Meanwhile, what I am, is just that, right? What I am is worship. What I am is prayer. See? So that's the high level comprehension and knowing, and especially after the breakthrough, right? After the breakthrough. And for one person out of many to claim a breakthrough, and then again, tallest lily or whatever we're calling it, crabs in a bucket, people seeking to negate that or pull me down to their level. And now what's that based on? Right? Well, most likely it's based on me claiming this and performing this, Benton doing these things. It's a mirror held up to other people, much like the first 4-minute mile or whatever. The first time one runner breaks through that barrier, what was previously thought to be extremely unlikely or impossible, well, now it's shown that, well, it is possible. And surprise, surprise, several other runners break through that barrier, or what was seemingly a nearly impossible barrier prior to that. Then at least a few others did it pretty quickly. And then now today it's just normal for a somebody who runs the mile at any level of training and skill, right? Same thing here, So Benton claiming the breakthrough in some level is holding up a mirror to the performance of the other runners, right? Because there's a whole bunch of frou-frou, flowery spiritual talk, right? Benton certainly is not the originator of the frou-frou spiritual talk, right? Do I have an attraction to some of that? Certainly, yeah, of course. Absolutely. So do you see where this is going, right? And then what, again, in the context of a game of incomplete information, and deductive reasoning around what these other individuals have going on, is like, okay, what's the motivation for this mockery and ridicule? They have to be getting something out of it, right? And so my own understanding of that, so much so that, I've had random people come into the live chat and try to have a go at me from the live chat, just random people who hear me and assume I'm some sort of boomer who doesn't understand the internet. It's like, yeah, I have some boomer tendencies, I'm sure, but I've been on the internet every day since 1994. It's certainly possible to get to me, but that's less and less over time. But, having so studied the tactics of the trolls, your typical troll, I've demonstrated multiple times on here to have a back and forth as I'm speaking out loud and the person is typing into the chat to actually predict ahead of time what they were going to do before they did it, right? As I did yesterday. I predicted, what was going to happen as it was happening. Now, a lot of that is presumption, right? It's called educated guess. And again, it may not have all been directed my way. But again, from Benton's perspective, the Royal We's perspective, it's all directed Benton's way on some level. So it's certainly pertaining, right? And I'm not claiming any victimhood. That's not the point of this. The point of this was for me to talk it out enough to not have a day and a half of a crash out like I did before, like just before the breakthrough to the true knowledge of self. See, Benton had no way of knowing that Benton was on the precipice of this breakthrough, and then here came this very strong spiritual attack around notions of the Lord's Prayer, because that's when Benton was very strongly beginning to push Psalm 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd. And then a whataboutism showed up about, attacking, well, what about this, basically calling certain ways of approaching, uh, you know, the mundanities and the pressing matters of this delusory realm, at a level of what would be construed as a lowly beggar, right? Or a person, an impoverished person, or someone at the bottom of society, right? Which, surprise, surprise, that's who Jesus interacted with most often. That's who Jesus chose to spend his time with in the Bible. All of those people that are now going to get, not all of them, but many of those folks are now going to find themselves targeted by the government, not Trump. Trump is not targeting them. The government, as I predicted, is targeting these individuals. Okay. The people at the bottom rungs of society. In fact, that is what's happening with the majority of these raids. The least powerful, right? The most disadvantaged, right? The people with the least education, the lowest level IQs, and I'm just calling it like I see it. When your average person who shows up here from, some of these countries, yeah, many of them are quite intelligent. The overall is to lack in IQ. Now, probably that would go along with maybe, a lack of formal education. I don't know. Right. I'm talking about their own abilities to think and reason, and which, so really it's a sophisticated American. Somebody who grows up here is quite sophisticated, but then at the level of, what they can do, with higher education and serving corporations, white collar office jobs, all of this, even, higher technical jobs, coding and all of these things, computer programming, IT administrators. Nobody's coming to the country from Latin America. Very few are coming here and becoming systems administrators or whatever. Okay, so these are the people who've already been identified as this is who scrubs the toilets. This is who cleans the floors. This is who picks the fruit and the vegetables, right? And so now that the government is saying, okay, a lot of these people are now being evicted from the country, and well, step one was don't let them in anymore, right? To do these jobs. Step two is, kick them out. And then, so what's step three? Well, before the technology arrives, so assuming that automation is going to be able to do all of these jobs in the near future, well, in that intermediate time, there's all these dregs of society. Again, the people that Jesus would hang out with. There's all of these dregs of society who are from here, right? Or maybe some of the people came here from other lands and then became dregs of society. So now there's all of these dregs of society that are a drain on the system. I've talked about before, like in a lot of cities, a lot of these big cities have figured out that just you can more or less take $80,000 a year and multiply that by the number of homeless people. And that's more or less what it averages out to, that the city and the county and maybe the state spends to deal with these folks. And that's because there's a few individuals, or a small percentage of individuals they wreak so much havoc that when you average this out, and then, what the system chooses to spend on, sheltering folks and providing resources, which is really a drop in the bucket compared to hospitalizations, since, of course, and America not having a nationalized health system, unlike the vast majority of all Western nations. And then this idea of, and I don't want to get political or geopolitical, I'm making a point. I just happened to read in passing that apparently the money, and again, do your own research, this is just something I heard, it's like 20 to 30% of the nation of Israel's budget is the money that the United States gives them. And then Israel has, nationalized healthcare, or healthcare for all, and America doesn't, right? And then, the lack of mental health services. So what's happened is there's been an executive order. The government has put an order in place to make it easier to involuntarily institutionalize these mentally ill street people. Okay. And so if that happens, the fact that it's being announced in no way means that it's going to happen. And I've assumed that this is going to happen for a long ass time when the government, and some people will say Trump, but when the government during Trump's first term began to talk openly about rounding up the homeless and then more or less having camps on the outskirts of the city, and then simultaneously Dr. Drew in Los Angeles had been talking about needing to change the laws to be able to put some of these people into institutions for their own good, which I do agree with some of that. Some of these people, because of the way the laws and the court rulings have gone, unless they're willing to go into treatment or mental health services, they can only really be committed for, very limited periods of time generally. And this is always tied back to the notion of, oh, well, Reagan, closed down the mental hospitals or the state mental hospitals. It's like, well, the government did that, right? I don't know that. Again, why must there be a Mr. Peanut? It's like Trump is now the Mr. Peanut of kicking people out of the country and rounding up the homeless potentially. Why do humans need that strong figure to blame everything on? Right. And so when I bebop around on foot and people here are mad at Trump, my thing is like, no, it's the government. It's not Trump. It's what the government's doing. It's not Biden. These are figureheads at the level of, what can they embody? Let's put a lot of negative. It's really about being able to place a bunch of negative aspects and emotions onto one individual and just say, that's the scapegoat and that's the problem. While, some portion of the populace will just sign off on everything that individual does, no matter what it is, right? Because that's their guy. And that's what's happening here, okay? So assuming that this actually happens, which it probably will, and I'm seeing YouTube videos now, like there's this one homeless channel where for many, many years, the content creator travels around and makes halfway decent documentaries, talking about what homelessness is like in a particular part of the country. And then, of course, he's, one of these, what would be referred to, not my term, what would be referred to as a bleeding heart liberal, right? So he's always going to take the side of the people versus the strong authority that is oppressing them. And make no mistake, these folks are being oppressed by the government. The mere fact that I can refer to the writings attributed to Benito Mussolini around notions of, from the perspective of the state, everything's the state, meaning the corporations, the citizens, the government, the banking system, right? The individual state governments, the individual city governments, the individual county governments, all of it is the state, including the citizens, right? Property of the state. Under those notions, it's the state that has chosen to conduct America such that the situation is what it is, right? The people of America have done nothing other than not stop it, right? Again, that's just to stand by on the sidelines. Now, to say words and to vote and to be mind controlled into wholly negative political motivations, meaning the motivation is almost always a negative motivation. It's not somebody saying, well, this is what intellectually I think are important issues, and then let me go and figure out which candidate lines up with my ideas the most and then vote for that person, which that's what I did when I still thought voting mattered whatsoever. While understanding it's a fool's errand or folly to vote for a Republican or a Democrat under any circumstances, because it's not a horse race. There's not a betting slip printed out, and then if my horse comes in, I get to turn in the betting slip for a prize. That's not how elections work. Meanwhile, as most of us know, it's neither here nor there. Anyway, the government's going to do what it wants to do. So the reason why all of these folks from other countries are here is because the state of, right, the United States, recognized that it needed labor. The corporation said we must have access to labor at the price we're willing to pay, and that labor will be conducted under the conditions that we prescribe. And in order to accomplish that, people who are willing to do all of that must have been brought here. So that's happened. Now, as the transition to a lot of these jobs being fully automated is upon us, right? Now, for whatever reason, and I don't fully know the reasons, but now it's the time in which those folks can be kicked the fuck out and then stop bringing new ones for the low-level jobs. And then, oh, look at this, all of these dregs of society. And the fact is, some proportion of the street people can be made to do low-level jobs. Absolutely. But only when forced. They're, I would say less than 1% would do some version of what I did, which was go off and get the certifications and training to go drive a truck. And that's even, the person has to be willing and able to meet the qualifications, a lot of which comes down to the criminal record and the background check. Oh, one moment. I have no cough button since we're on not on StreamYard, so apologies. Oh, man. So I foresee a time in the near future, and okay, back to the YouTube channel, doing all of these documentaries about homelessness. Well, now in the more barbaric regions of the middle part of the country, like I think Lexington, Kentucky, perhaps was Louisville, Kentucky, which is a very specific place. That's where Cassius Clay became so incensed by how he was being treated that he famously, again, official fiction, he was in downtown Louisville and hurled his gold medal into the river that he'd won boxing. And this was Muhammad Ali. It was Cassius Clay at the time. And there's your 33. Right. So now I'm seeing that in Louisville, they've almost entirely criminalized homelessness itself, because if folks have forgotten, most of my years of homelessness was under the auspices of, there had been a court ruling from what's considered a very liberal court on the West Coast, right, which really a very heavily left-leaning or leftist judges had made a court ruling that, well, a person will die eventually because of sleep deprivation, will prove fatal eventually. So they're saying that these people, in order to continue their lives, they have to be able to sleep somewhere. And that's where all of this notions around it limited, at the level of lawsuits and settlements, it limited the ability for nationwide for municipalities to be able to combat people sleeping in the streets, pitching tents in the parks, and all of these things, which I don't necessarily have a problem with that, if it's done appropriately. Right. Now, I myself have exited the Salvation Army in downtown Austin, Texas, which has an actual Skid Row. And I observed this is way before the pandemic, I observed 2 Austin PD officers before they defunded their police. I observed APD writing tickets to homeless people sleeping on the sidewalk at 4 a.m. Right. Meanwhile, I would not oppress. There's no amount of money. There is no amount of money I would accept to treat homeless people this way. They've already got it bad, right? Again, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus not do? And I remember, this, again, many years ago, but just looking at what was happening, and as I'm, walking to the bus stop to take the bus to whatever I was doing, and that early in the morning, I would have been off to truck driving school or whatever I needed to do, probably off to the park to do my practices, and then, off to truck driving school, whatever I was doing that day. I was on a schedule, regimented schedule, and just, looking at the situation and going, bow down before the one you serve. You're going to get what you deserve. Recognizing it's not appropriate for me to intervene. I have no authority to intervene here, but, well, that's not even necessarily true, but it's, would have not been the thing to do, clearly. And it would not have bore any fruit anyway, but which is some acknowledgement of just how unjust that is. Well, again, the vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions, how can there ever be justice in a vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions? I would say that the fact that the realm itself exists on that basis precludes it from justice, at least across the board. So, of course, there's going to be injustices. Okay. Now, in the long run, would it be better for many of these street people, mentally ill, drug users, illicit drug users, for the streets to be cleaned up and for them not have the option of accepting treatment? Would it be better for many of those individuals? Absolutely. And this is where, Benton is, as much as he is more left-leaning overall than right-leaning, and that's surely should be clear by now. And also, I'm not even a fan of that. That's only when Benton is willing to even put himself in that context, which is, it doesn't even feel right. But for purposes of discussion, this is why Benton never fully fits into either one of the two groups, and that's how it's designed, because it's two ideologies that are designed to seemingly oppose each other, right? When in fact it functions as one ideology, and that one ideology serves the state of course it does, right? Of course it does. But yeah, so a leftist can never, a true leftist is precluded from acknowledging that, yes, some of these people, their lives would improve if they were institutionalized, because what will happen is, after a few years, some of these people will regain their sanity. Some of them will be rehabilitated off of the substances, and will be then in a state or condition when they can be pressed into service picking vegetables or just whatever low levels job need to be done. Now, will they freely choose to do that? Yes, some of them will. Some of them will just be like, hey, yeah, they'll be so in love with the fact that they were rehabilitated. They feel so much better than they used to. They were living in a hell on the streets. I mean, that's hell on earth. That's a living hell. That is absolutely hell on earth for those folks. And will they then just more or less go do whatever they're told? Sure. And then other people, it's just simply not going to be up to them once they become actual legal property of the state. And that's what we're talking about. It's almost like the military at that level. It's like they lose once the person once a judge says that this individual is now no longer legally has standing to conduct their own affairs, right? They're more on some level declared incompetent, and then must be institutionalized for their own protection and the protection of the society at large. Well, that's some version of a slave, right? That's some version. It's no longer up to them. So just like America abolished slavery, except for people who are incarcerated, right? Prisoners are still able to be, even if they're paid a very low wage, that's still effectively slavery. Well, it's going to be the same thing with whoever ends up institutionalized, whoever or forced into these camps. So as we see the raids, and as I see on Drudge Report, and as I see in news items, some media accounts sort of fretfully talking about FEMA camps, right? And then back to the so-called truth community and the conspiracy theory versions of, I myself was quite fearful in a fear space around the notion of FEMA camps. Well, doesn't it make complete sense for, it seems to make a lot of sense for the government to do this first, right? And we saw during the fake pandemic, and probably some of the fake pandemic was taking the pulse of the populace to see how open is the populace to the idea of camps to like quarantine people, right? And all of these things. So why wouldn't the system or the government now do it? But we're going to do it with the people who don't have full legal standing, right? So first you see it done to the migrants, then phase two, do it to the street people who are unable or unwilling for whatever reason to serve the vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions. And make no mistake, society creates these people on some level. Yeah, some people do end up there through their free choice, absolutely. And society absolutely creates these folks as well. It's both things simultaneously. And then, so step one, do it to it's basically starting at the lowest levels of society, right? Who could conceivably have even lower status than a mentally ill street person? Well, perhaps arguably somebody who has no status, has no legal status here whatsoever, because up until the point that they are committed to an institution, the mentally ill homeless person that was born here has a legal standing versus, I can't say that the migrant doesn't have no legal standing, but it's up in the air, right? It's seeking of asylum and all of these things, or coming here through a legal process. So the person who avoids the legal process and manages to cross without being detected, at least when they cross. I mean, I'm certainly they're detected at some point, but they don't seek asylum. Then other ones show up at the border and cross the border and immediately turn themselves in as soon as possible to the Border Patrol, and they seek asylum. And then, as we've seen, not Biden, right? It wasn't Biden that did these things. The government chose to undergo a process where they said, okay, here's your court date, or we're going to let you know when your court date is. And then that would be several years in the future. And then the people either showed up or they didn't, right? And that was to have a legal hearing around, will they be granted asylum, from fleeing, political persecution, at one time, like I think it was El Salvador or Honduras or whatever, more or less had the highest murder rate in the world or whatever. So legally, especially under a more under globalism and all of these, the World Trade Organization and whatever these multinational bodies are, whatever the International Court of Settlements, I think that's business, but there's some version of that somewhere internationally. It's sort of America, I'm sure, at a contractually obligated somewhere to have some sort of process of people being able to seek asylum, because otherwise, when I look at government, and not Trump's government, when I look at what the United States government has done and continues to do, it doesn't seem to me like the United States government would even have these processes of people being able to come here and then seek asylum unless it was more or less made to or required to. I don't see in a vacuum the USA choosing to do that, right? It's just my opinion, though. So yeah, it's going to get very interesting on that front. And then, again, why has Benton, while living in that world, Benton has strategically maintained himself in various ways where, the likelihood of Benton being subjected to very much of that, while it exists, is quite low, right? But then as more and more of your own friends and family potentially fall into homelessness, right? And especially in the middle parts of the country where we're seeing places like Louisville, Kentucky, and many other, and I myself have been to many of these places. Let's not forget, I've been there before the court decision. And then, so recently that all got overturned. That's what I sort of buried the lead there. So within the last year, I believe, year or two, that court decision got overturned because Grants Pass, Oregon, sued, and it went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, I believe, going from memory. And the United States Supreme Court said, okay, well, actually, this is unconstitutional or whatever. They overturned it to where now local municipalities can effectively criminalize homelessness, so that, now tickets and arrests can be made and for sleeping on the sidewalk, right? Sleeping in a public park. Now, who doesn't get persecuted for this is people like Benton, who's only a couple of times ever had the police show up in the morning where I was sleeping. And, my many, however many thousands of nights I've slept rough. And then Benton almost always decamping in the morning. So, the fact is, the people who are getting ticketed and arrested, these are the folks who just either lack the ability or maybe just are so depressed or on drugs or unmotivated that they're just simply unable to be moved along in a orderly fashion, and they get written tickets and arrested. Right. And then once they end up without IDs, you know, a lot of people don't understand homelessness. They become homeless. You know, at some point, somebody's going to steal all their shit. You know, not everybody knows to have their documents on them at all times and guard them like a hawk, right? And once their documents are lost, and they end up in the system at the level of being written tickets and expected to pay fines, it's pretty much a wrap for them at that point, right? And then, you know, it's a chicken or the egg versus, you know, at the level of, did they become homeless because of their drug addiction, or did they become drug addicts because of the homelessness, right? And I know for a fact it's normal in homelessness for people, it being so dangerous and people not being adjusted to homelessness. A lot of folks who were not strictly speaking meth heads to end up using methamphetamine to be able to stay awake and walk around all night and then to sleep in the daytime. Like, for real, that happens. Not as an excuse, but, and then again, you know, why are the drugs here in the first place? It's because the government has chosen to allow the drugs, right? And again, this is all indefensible. So when I talk about, you know, hell realm, and I've more transitioned into calling it this vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions, right? Well, this is indefensible. How can this ever be defended? And this is where the mockers and the ridiculers of yours truly, this is where they don't seem to understand or care where their own assertions fall short. This is one of the places in which it falls short, is to mock and ridicule what Benton is asserting is one thing, but then how do they not recognize that it's occurring, the mockery and ridicule is occurring in the context of it places them in the position of having to defend the United States of America and its indefensible actions. And now, how does that happen for the individual? Well, it has to be some version of putting their head in the sand. It has to be some version of building up calluses and to treat these street people as if they're subhuman. And I saw some notion of that in the comments. The content creator on this live stream yesterday, I screenshotted where they had typed in something about like they were out in town or whatever, and saw a homeless person, and, you know, more or less talking about by the time they parked their car, circled back, parked their car, approached on foot, and, you know, maybe the person had already left, but they were only going to give them a couple of bucks anyway, or maybe give them something to drink, and more or less saying, well, what's the point? And what I would say is, you know, absolutely, you're correct. What is the point of defending a society that creates that? That's a feature, not a bug, folks. And then the fact is, the spiritual attack and what will always be levied against those people is the idea of, well, their choices led to this. Well, that's true in part. I'm never going to let people completely out of jail at the level of personal responsibility. Absolutely, there's personal responsibility there. However, again, based on notions of following the teachings of Christ, and again, not everybody has set this as a goal. Certainly, as far as I know, the content creator I'm speaking of, having a background in, I believe, Catholicism, but maybe not, claiming to be endeavoring to follow the teachings of Christ from the Gospels of the New Testament of the Bible. Certainly not wanting to speak for another individual here. But again, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus not do? Jesus, again, would lack the ability to make someone's situation worse. Okay. So, and, you know, I agree with the person on some level, because I've been the person in an 18-wheeler who saw somebody at the corner and I wanted to give them $20. And then now I'm driving like, okay, where can I park this 18-wheeler? And then by the time I found a parking lot I could pull into, it was like, am I really going to physically jog over there, you know, and cross a busy street and hope they're still there, which they probably were, but then, and I got shit to do, right? Because I've agreed to be employed, at the time was employed as a long haul truck driver. So yeah, I relate to that part of it. And then, you know, why are people even allowed to fall through the cracks? Again, this is indefensible. you have a society, you have a country that on the one hand that is happy to give the majority of what the so-called taxpayer pays into the system through federal income tax. And let's get, can we please, as Americans, disabuse ourselves of the notion of, you know, people at the bottom of society getting checks or getting money or getting resources. Can we please, why won't the people divorce themselves from notions around, yeah, that's your tax money? As if Americans don't care, man. Americans don't give a flying fuck what their tax dollars go for. And that's based on watching Americans allow their tax dollars to go directly to banks and corporations. Right. That's what I'm talking about. So again, back to reconciliation. If there's a reconciliation at the top with the taxpayers' dollars, where it's not just handed over to people who are already so rich that 10 generations from now, their descendants won't ever have to do anything whatsoever that they don't choose to do. They will be born into fabulous wealth, just like the 9 generations before them were. And this indefensible system, because bankers always pay themselves first, it now sees fit through its own mismanagement to hand over the majority of what the typical tax-paying American is paying into the system, thus proving the American taxpayer at the level of their own actions or inactions does not give a flying fuck what the tax dollars go to. Okay. But then simultaneously, based on their own, maybe jealousy or whatever it is, or just, martyring themselves because, well, they have to have a job. And then why are these other people getting shit for free? It's like, well, bankers are already so rich, they can just fuck off and never work again. And they're getting way more money than the so-called welfare queens are getting. So I don't even, number one, I don't understand the point. But then it's always sort of like in the YouTube comments, it's framed or couched as if, oh, well, that's your tax dollars paying for that. And that implies that Americans have any regard whatsoever for what their tax dollars go to. And no, they do not. Otherwise, there would not be bailouts of banks. In fact, there wouldn't be a Federal Reserve. In fact, monetary policy with taxation and the employment system, it simply could not function the way that it functions, and this is my opinion, if the American people gave a damn about how taxes were spent. America doesn't give a fuck how its taxes are spent. Clearly. It just doesn't. So, if we total up the amount of dollars that are going to, all of these entities, whatever's going to the po folks at the bottom is a drop in the motherfucking bucket, y'all. That's just a fact. And facts don't care about feelings. That's just the reality within delusion, right? That's the, again, waking dream, surrealistic, unreal, right, aspects, right? I mean, that's quite surreal for me to see Americans incensed about the waste and fraud in something like Social Security, but then have absolutely nothing to say with 1.15 trillion last fiscal year, going to already rich bankers for interest on the national debt. And that amount far exceeds whatever could be stolen, right, or misappropriated through programs like Social Security, right? So yeah, I would much rather see a system where folks who need some assistance are able to get the assistance, because those are individual human beings who probably are suffering, right? Meanwhile, who doesn't suffer, at least in the context of daily life? The people who are taking the most amount of money from the government. They never suffer on those levels, right? Ever. And so this is what I mean when I talk about the system itself is indefensible. So, of course, when people want to come against some of the notions that Benton puts forth, the royal we puts forth, is that even possible without mockery and ridicule and appealing to the fickle feelings of the peanut gallery? Because strategically, they are placing themselves in position to where at some point they will be made to defend a system that I view as indefensible. Now, a lot of onus will be placed upon, uh, and I do need to slow down a little bit, some of my own resentments. While it's helpful in healing for the feelings of resentment, the past stagnated resentments to find to take their flight in this moment, this is very healing. The reality is it doesn't need to occur, um, so quickly. It can come out. It can leave. It can take its leave in a longer form. And I feel like I've hammered those points home enough. I do want to talk about the healing in the name of Jesus. Power in the name of Jesus. The indescribable levels of healing I've been receiving over. I mean, it's been a long time now, but it certainly has leveled up and ramped up since the unlocking of the achievement recently. Oh, I do have a mute button. I see it. Never mind. There is a mute. Fascinating. Um, on the screen. And especially I've talked about my shoulder and my right upper back, and that has been healing over a period of actually many years. And man, it's been just incredible. It's been amazing what's happened with this recently. Just even my breathing, it's just like, wow. I got to a point yesterday. It was like, man, it's like, not even knowing how restricted my breathing was on the right side of my body. It's like I really wasn't aware of how restricted it had been until that healing had happened. And just now the tissues, now the rib cage is able to expand a little farther, right? Yeah, what a blessing. And again, it's all blessings. What I am represents blessing. Um, and then, so back to the hell realm talk, or again, vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions. It's now become crystal clear to Benton, although my own full acceptance of this idea is not, I'm not fully there to full acceptance. It probably is the 7 stages of grief on some level, but the fact is, what this breakthrough has created is an understanding now that virtually every individual who hasn't had such a breakthrough or some version of that, right, will only ever be able to interface with Benton based on notions. It's going to at some point become, for their own purposes, they're going to need me to internalize certain notions that simply don't pertain to me in order to suit their purposes, which is, this does represent person A attempting to gratify themselves. Oh, it's person A using person B for person A's own gratification. And it doesn't have to be a sexual context. See, and then I would be person B in this scenario. So in order for them to be gratified at the level of not having to defend an indefensible system, and then not be expected to, air quotes, do better, right, individually, because let's not forget, a big part of the mind control and the programming, especially as Americans, and this was borne out through the TV show Mad Men, my favorite TV show, perhaps one of them, certainly. I think it's the best show of that style ever. And the character Don Draper, at a certain point, talking about what advertising is all about is to um, to assure the individual that whatever they happen to be doing at any given moment is absolutely appropriate and proves on some level that they are, fully whole, fully, recognized members of society, fully realized human beings, and it's been attached to advertising and consumption. And again, consumption as the national religion. The national religion is consumerism, and people defining themselves on those bases. What they smoke, what they drink, right? Um, because this was Mad Men was in the '60s, so a lot of it was booze brands, what type of car they drive, right? And a lot of it is make your mark on the world, show your stuff, okay? And which is interesting because society, the system has now shifted towards, less of that notion of individually boldly going, sort of making one's mark on the world, and then but then that getting co-opted or subverted into purchasing products and services at the level of branding, if that makes sense. Whether it's Coca-Cola, um, Lucky Strike, I think was one of the big clients in the show, General Motors, and all of these things. People's association with brands being in some way how they view themselves, in relation to the branding. And again, like what Donald Draper's talking about is maybe like driving down the road. And I think this is how it was depicted in the TV show, driving down a highway or a road coming into town. And here are the billboards with the products. And it's to constantly reassure the person that whatever they happen to be doing, that's exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And, that they're great people for this. And, this is everything's hunky dory and wonderful. See? Which is what? That's a fantasy. That's a fantasy. So even back then, in the '60s, this acknowledgement of, placing the individual into a fantasy world, at least a portion of the time, and doing it intentionally for the purpose of the system, what suits the system, what reinforces the system. All right. So feel free to defend that all you want, folks. See, strategically, Benton the entire time has been, the royal we this whole time has been behaving based upon notions of strategically, or in a chess game, that's an unsupportable position. So, if it ever comes to debate level blows, that position will not be supportable. That now, I could be wrong. I don't think that I am, but that's where the royal we lies with all of that. I feel like I might need a bathroom break, but I'm going to push on through. It looks like the data, it's not going to chew up all my data, so to do the streams this way. So that's good news. So I think I could go. I know I can go a little longer. Shout out to the chat. Shout out to replay crew. Appreciate y'all. And so when I look at the mockers and the ridiculers, again, how and where is all of this reconciled through their own, cosmologies or worldviews? It's simply never accounted for. And again, I'm going to guess that there's going to be some level of repression involved, and there's some level of especially defending something that's simply not defendable, right? And then at the level of a social contract, and again, back to the withholding. So here's how the indefensible nature is somewhat sidestepped. It's that via the social contract, love and acceptance withheld until the individual performs in such a way to meet the status quo at the level of a social contract. Oh, okay, they're doing the things, so now we accept them, right? And presumably Benton, who's certainly way less accepted, arguably, than at times in the past, which is fine. Benton here, the royal we is not entitled to any of this, but sort of noticing that as as Benton's own cosmology or views of things or knowings continues to grow and change and evolve on a progression, and as those ideas continue to be communicated, the way that Benton is received is very different, right? Or can be very different. And then also some of the other individuals' views are growing and changing or stagnating, which is that, yeah, there is no stoppage. You're right. It's devolving, right? Stagnation is a de-evolution, or yeah, that's to devolve, to go backwards. Right? To not move forward would be to go backwards. And we can say about Benton's life in the context of what society puts forth as these things to achieve, and what should be done in order to, be a productive member of society, right? That Benton certainly is not meeting many of those markers. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and then, but the progression and the moving forward of the thinking and the ideas and the spiritual practices and the knowing, see, that's what's important to Benton. And under freedom, right, were the country what it claims to be, that would all be completely fine. And there would be mechanisms built into society to support and facilitate someone who more or less is content to walk around and think about shit all day, and occasionally maybe write some things, although more seemingly these days, for the last however many years, more inclined to speak extemporaneously off the dome, or even in a more prepared format such as a podcast, which typically I would speak from an outline, right? This discourse. See, a proper society, right? A proper society would have mechanisms in place. It would recognize, oh, well, there's 330 million people or whatever, and some percentage of these people are simply not going to be able to be maneuvered through the same systems that 80 to 85% of everybody else are maneuvered through. However, some percentage of that 20 to 15% remaining will absolutely contribute and contribute to society for the benefit of society if they're met where they live and if they're facilitated. But remember, it's pull myself up by my bootstraps. Anything that doesn't completely line up with whatever the status quo is in a authoritarian society, the authoritarian society says, hey, Benton, here's how you must behave. Here's the metrics you must meet, or we don't accept you. You're rejected and cast out entirely. That's one of the many indefensible aspects of American society. And I think what happens for the folks who would, you know, end up potentially in a position of defending the system, I believe some of that happens through their own fantastical notions that, well, it is possible for enough of the masses to come together and to fix enough of these problems that in the future society could more resemble what Benton is contending would represent a proper society. And my response to that would be, okay, show me. Because until then, it's mere conjecture, and I don't believe you. I don't take your word for it. I don't accept this notion without proof that individuals will or are even capable of coming together and doing such things. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the populace is happy and contented to farm out their own responsibilities to whoever is craven and seeking of power and lovers of themselves enough to seek these high positions in administration to then make decisions on behalf of an uneducated populace who is more or less proud that they don't really know much of anything at all and don't give a flying fuck what the government does with their own resources in the form of their tax dollars and other resources. Simply doesn't care. Or may actually kind of think it's funny and sort of like a black comedy version of, just watching it all burn, right? There's certainly elements of that. And these are all, again, features of humanity, not a bug. These are all features of humanity, right? Hit that like button if you haven't already, if you're into that. If not, that's okay. I don't even like talking that way, but it does seem to be part of the whole YouTube thing now. sort of instruct people. And I'm so into actual freedom, I don't even like telling people what to do. But I certainly detest being told what to do, but um, you know, uh, I'm able to cope with it in some way. But uh, and yeah, it's just again, defend the system that has a fake pandemic and uh, you know came as close to forced inoculations as it possibly could, and now here come all the articles where Stanford University and these other institutions are saying, well, actually, it turns out that none of this saved nearly as many lives as claimed, and in fact, the only real measurable benefit was to maybe some very young people and maybe some very old people, maybe, right, and that for the rest of the populace, it was more or less not helpful at all, right, and so on the one hand, to be in a position to defend the system that would come that close to forcing inoculations, and that the very same system, however many years later, saying, well, yeah, turns out. Now, some people will say, well, that's not the government saying that, that's Stanford saying that. Well, we're back to Benito Mussolini's concept of the state. It's all one thing, folks. It's all one thing, right? So yeah, it's the system telling you these things, or telling us these things, and that's just how it goes, on the ground in dystopia. And and remember, no power to do anything about it whatsoever. Does the individual have power, over their internal space? Well, perhaps yes, perhaps no. Do they have some measure of if they have access to resources, sort of choosing, well, the majority of the people around here are from flyover states and living in some version of a rural life and so-called homesteading, which is, even this concept of homesteading, I'm seeing like now, like one of my channels that I like, After Prison Show, and Joe does stuff. Oh, Joe Guerrero, one of his fans apparently is air quotes homesteading, which turns out to just be somebody with some trailers on like 3 acres of land somewhere who's like doing some gardening and some farming and has some animals. Bro, I grew up in Arkansas. Like that was just normal when I grew. Nobody had a name for it. It was country folks or whatever. But now it's homesteading. I think it should be called city folk becoming so uh, disenfranchised and just falling out of love with whatever they've been living, and to actually begin to start to romanticize some version of something called homesteading. Meanwhile, you know, for anybody who did not grow up on a farm to then go into from city life to the life of a farmer, that's just not going to happen. Uh, you know, for that's just a bridge too far for most people. Um, and I'm happy that people have been able to do that in the past and continue to be able to live that way. Again, I'm always in favor of people getting to choose the path. But I would say, again, back to the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, the fact that some people are able to do that, I don't see how that reflects at all on the rest of society, because it's almost implying that, well, if everybody would would start to live this way, well, if everybody started to live that way, if everybody was living that way, how did the people who live that way now, how were they able to do that? How were they able to earn the money? How are they still earning money? How has this happened? And I would say it's happened through the existing system. It did not occur in a vacuum, right? And this idea of get out of the cities and city bad, country good, that's a very un-American idea. You know, large cities is one of the most American things possible, right? New York City is one of the most American things possible. Okay, the New York Yankees, you perhaps the most American thing possible, right? And then why, again, no reconciliation of this, just in a vacuum, bleeding sheep out of context, just bleeding things. And again, uh, attempting to spiritually attack and undermine my own, you know, what I've asserted. To what purpose, right? To avoid addressing the actual problems, because to address the actual societal problems would first necessitate the individual discovering and accepting that, wow, the individual has no power whatsoever with respect to these issues. And yes, the loop into problem solving happens, but the individuals who are looping into the problem solving, they have no standing or power to do anything about what the system is doing. None. 0% power level. Because what the system is doing only exists outside of the individual, except for the parts of the system that the individual internalizes. So when I ran into these commies, these communist kids on the street, that's what I told them. One of them said something to me. I said, "That's system speak, brother." I said, "What you just said is the language of the system itself." Because part of growing up in America is to internalize some of these notions that are on behalf of the system itself, to propagate the system. And then pretty soon the individual doesn't understand, oh, no, you didn't come up with that idea. That's system speak, brother or comrade. That's system speak. I didn't call him comrade, but if I did, it'd be a joke. But that's system speak, a lot of this stuff. And if I fall into system speak, I'd like to think that I would have the ability to recognize it and understand where do some of these ideas originate. And again, what I would hope for people individually is that they would think for themselves. And that's what I told the commies. I said, ultimately at the end of the day, I don't do my best not to give advice, but what I would want for people is that they think for themselves. And if these commie kids have gotten to this point of thinking communism is the way to go, well, hopefully at least one of the two got there through his own thought process. And then if he continues to think for himself, most likely he will at least have the opportunity to discover that, well, ideology itself is a mistake. Doesn't matter what the ideology is. Is it communism and ideology? Yes, therefore it will prove itself invalid. Is capitalism an ideology? Yes, it is. Well, it will prove itself invalid. Is MAGA or right-wing or traditional family values Christianity, is that an ideology? Yes, it is. Well, it will prove itself invalid. Right? Because all of that is of this world of death. And by nature, it's all dead. And no life can emanate from something dead, right? It can be animated through the creative force of the individual or collection of individuals. But that's not life. That's as alive as a stop motion film of Gumby or whatever from the old days. It's the same. It's animation. It's the exact same level of life, right? Again, waking dreams, surrealistic unreality. That's what's being discussed. And it's endlessly novel and fascinating, certainly. But shout out to proper identification, because I see now with proper identification, especially now that I've gotten through the cranky old man portion of the morning, I'm Benton, the royal we, is effectively unbothered by these spiritual attacks, and in fact, may very well find some benefit therein, right? And again, continued leveling up, and then back to the idea of recognizing how individuals are going to treat me. And the fact is, there's not going to be enthusiasm and positivity directed towards Benton based on leveling up. And I've had a concept even before the true knowledge of self was unlocked, this concept of cheer the level up, because I realized, if I had a friend, right, or in the past when I had friends, then when I unlocked an achievement or made progress towards my goals, my friends would acknowledge and in some way celebrate that, right? And not because they were required to, because of enthusiasm and positivity, right? And probably some version of a social contract also. That probably was a little more expected of people. What's expected of people nowadays is that nobody's ever going to try to brag for anything about anything or take credit in public, or people are going to be very falsely modest, while simultaneously it's a keeping up with the Joneses with the social, what is portrayed on social media. So it's, again, now we're back to the cognitive dissonance and the psychological schisms created by sort of living both ways simultaneously, right? Whereas Benton was socialized under notions of it ain't bragging if you can back it up, right? Um, Meaning, yeah, Benton can brag about, okay, well, I had, again, famous example from college. Um, my sophomore year of college, when still had, when I hadn't become too overweight to use my basketball skills back then, um, that one of my roommates would come home from the intramural facility called the Hyper, indoor basketball courts, and he would come home almost every day after classes and claim to have, scored all these points and made all these 3-pointers at the Hyper, right? And that's fine because it ain't bragging if you can back it up. But at some point, somebody's going to call this fella to the carpet. And by then I was no longer playing at the Hyper. I think most of mine was at my freshman year. I played quite a bit of pickup basketball and did, again, quite well, as I would be expected to. And that was something I had devoted many years of my life to becoming, as good as I was able to at it. But from a pickup basketball, street ball um, side of things. And so I guess we were night owls back then. And I know I didn't even go to class half the time. So I know around midnight, I found a basketball goal somewhere on campus. So me and him would go out there at midnight and play one-on-one, right? Guy never beat me one time. Now, he could shoot the basketball, right? So I have no idea whether he was making all these 3-pointers or not. But I know he wasn't good enough to ever one time beat me in a one-on-one game of basketball. So did he do less bragging about how many 3-pointers he made? So if he walks through the door with his basketball and his sweaty shirt, or his little bag, with his sweaty clothes in it, maybe he took a shower, or maybe he's about to take a shower, who knows? He walks through the door and in the past would have announced that he made 13 3-pointers or whatever. Well, he sees me sitting on the couch and maybe it's going to be 5 or 6. See what I mean? And meanwhile, I'm not going down there to check up on him. Who cares? All I know is if we go play basketball tonight at midnight, he ain't going to beat me. And, also, he probably really liked basketball and wanted to get better. The fact that he was willing to go lose time after time after time after time. And then maybe we would play a game of horse and maybe he'd probably win more of those than I would. Who knows? Right. And, I say all that only, the idea of it ain't bragging if you can back it up. Well, that's all over with now. Now everybody has to be falsely modest. What? No, I don't. I get to be however I want to be. Anybody don't like it, that's their problem. And when I grew up, that was just considered normal. That because that's called actual freedom. People were still so brainwashed that they thought they were free back then, I guess. And I guess they thought that, well, if this guy wants to be an ornery asshole and aggressive about this stuff, I guess that's just how it is, right? And we'll just deal with it. And that's all gone for the most part. It still exists, in certain pockets, in certain ways. Mostly gone. Mostly gone. And, yeah. Yeah, that's all good stuff, certainly. Apropos of something, right? Has to be apropos of something. And so, it's not to toot Benton's horn, it's to recognize that effectively all of these other individuals are simply never, in the so-called truth community, they're never operating on all of these levels simultaneously that Benton is. And again, it ain't bragging if you can back it up. Well, I've been talking for 2 hours and 20 minutes and, feel free to play back the stream and pause and point by point have a go at the points, right? But why do that when that's probably not going to be possible, number one? And number two, why do that when it's so much more enjoyable and less onerous and arduous to just go to ridicule and mockery? Oh, well, we'll make fun of the way the guy talks, and we'll make fun of references made towards Book of Job, and we'll forget that we heard him say probably 20 times, and I mostly just mean chapter 1. And I remember saying multiple times, and I've never really gotten past chapter 1. Doesn't mean I didn't read past chapter 1. See, that's like and now I'm having to explain to people what a figure of speech is, right? To people who should have the ability to discern. Well, there's a thing in trolling and in mockery where there's a subtext and an implied context, and we just pretend like that doesn't exist, right? So Benton must have literally meant that he read the first chapter and stopped reading. It's like, no, what I mean is, in some ways, I've never gotten beyond that meaning, and this is my own fault for not properly explaining. In some ways, the current version of Benton has not gotten past the first chapter because that's what Benton has found to be most helpful. In the future, for his own purposes, in the future, perhaps other parts could become more relevant. Could, again, open to the possibility in an open-minded fashion. See, having an open mind. I would say that what these other people are demonstrating is the opposite of an open mind. And then, hilariously, and I don't want to mention a name, but a person in the live chat who's more or less known for lacking like coherence of thought, quickness of thought, plasticity of what do they call this? Neuroplasticity, right? If you gave this person some sort of written multiple choice test on whatever subject, probably would not score very well, which is fine. But and commenting about how something was dumb or some other person was dumb, and that may or may not have been directed at me. I'm not sure, but it's like, yo, let's not forget, Benton here was tested in the 99th percentile by the government itself. Now, yes, that was many years ago. That was 25 years ago, but it did happen. Benton did score in the 99th percentile on a multiple choice test. All right. So I don't know what to say. It's like, I'm no friggin' genius, but I will happily, in any place, at any time, any day of the week, I will put up my ability to be given a multiple choice test and to score higher than that person on the multiple choice test, provided it's not something that person has specialized in. Right. Put 10 different topics into a hat, draw the topic out, then have AI or whatever come up with 50 multiple choice questions, and I will absolutely score higher than that person, which is, again, who cares? Well, I must care because I'm speaking on it. But at this point, it's more about not inspiring those people to do better. Because remember, here's the answer to fixing society. Not that it can be fixed, but there's one solution to fixing society. Individuals must do better. Society cannot be improved or made less horrific or fixed in any way until individuals do better, right? That's it. And as we know, the human seeks efficiency, right? And it may be funny the way I pronounce efficiency, right? Some of these pronunciations has to do with the limitations of my own accent, my ridiculous accent, right? My slack-jawed yokel mode, right? And so what is efficient is to remain as one already is as much as possible. See? That's where the efficiency is. But I would say it's not efficiency, but that's what the human is set up to do, is to avoid putting a bunch of resources and energies into something that's not, that may not bear fruit, right? Again, now we're back to assertion, aggression, and dominance, because we're eschewing the feminine form where there's patience and trust that if a thing is worked towards, the reward will be contained in the undertaking itself, a spiritual surrender to that, and a willingness to put forth effort. This kind of sounds like a work ethic, a willingness to delay gratification and put in the work without a promise or guarantee that the reward will even exist. Now, what is the so-called American dream? The American dream functioned as a so-called promise or guarantee that if the individual did the few things, right, live below their means, work hard, whatever that is, then they will be rewarded in specific ways, right? And so now that it's been decades of writers and various people bemoaning the death of the American dream, you know, probably in every year going back my whole life, you can probably find a news article, some opinion piece somewhere where somebody wrote about the death of the American dream. So I was born in 75. You can probably find, a credible opinion piece in a newspaper or a magazine every single one of those years up until the present year about the death of the American dream. When was Hunter S. Thompson? Hunter S. Thompson was writing about the American dream before I was born, right? And in fact, I believe part of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which is not strictly autobiographical, but it was something about them going to some diner in the early hours of the morning and asking the waitress, we're looking for the American dream, do you know where it is? And they are interpreting that as if that's some like a restaurant or somebody's like, oh, I think I've heard of that. It was like thinking it might be, like another truck stop up the road might have a diner called the American Dream or something, right? Some version of that. And again, probably fictionalized, but probably some version of that happened in reality. You know, um, and then coming out of the Depression, what was the willingness of the Dust Bowl and the Okies and all of this? The willingness was, again, official fiction level. The willingness for people to do these very undesirable jobs was there. So the white man and perhaps the black man to some extent, uh, you know, the white man, especially the southern white man or um, you know, Mississippi River Delta, Oklahoma, these certain specific parts of the country and other areas too, I'm sure, there was the willingness to just basically do anything. And a lot of that came out of the deprivation, being withheld of the resources, being withheld of the opportunity to have a job and have a living wage, to where any amount of money and then a period of years where people were coached up, they were trained to live with almost nothing. That was the Depression, was teaching these people to have experiences where they've learned how to get by on almost nothing, and then say, okay, well, here are jobs for you now, and then this is what the jobs pay. And the people were already acquainted with living on almost nothing, so even they were probably able to scrimp and save coming out of the Depression, which sounds insane, but probably they were, because that's how far that they were living below any means. So once a regular paycheck comes in, they're not asking any questions, right? That's the American dream. The American dream is also all of these immigrants that have come here. So then now Whitey and the black folks to some extent getting spoiled over time, or what suited the system was for the descendants of those Americans, to then go into a blue collar, more industrialized factory type of work. And then again, the idea of the milkman earning enough money to own a home and his wife doesn't have to work, she gets to stay home and raise the kids. That was temporary, just like the Depression was temporary, just like the period of time, the Dust Bowl time, was temporary. Then the migrants. So then it was after the blue collar movement. Okay, now let's move the white folks into more like anybody with half a brain must go off to university. And right around 1960, also co-opting the other half of the potential workforce, right? Bringing them into the fold, beginning the process of bringing women into the workforce. And of course, World War II having something to do with that, even being socially acceptable on any level, right? And then, so by the time Benton comes along, as it's like, okay, now he's a sophomore in high school, he's a junior, he's a senior. What do we do with this kid, right? Well, oh well, he's able to sit in a desk all day. He's interested in books. He likes learning. Of course, I fucking hated school, right? Not I didn't hate the social aspects, but you know, again, I feel the resentments and a little bit of anger coming out there. So temporarily improperly identified. And again, what is it? What did I choose to allow to anger me? It was that was what passed for common sense at the time, and the word of mouthing of everything. Oh well, of course, Benton's got to go off to university because his father went off to university and it worked out quite well. And then, so we're not even going to concern ourselves with what does Benton want to do, and is he even college material in the first place? Well, what the system wants is anybody who is able to meet the requirements to go into the university, and then who is able to show up at least half the time, or in the case of high school, show up every day and at least tolerate whatever's being done, which in fact was, other than the social aspects, was a complete and total waste of my time. It really was. They taught me nothing. When they taught me how to read, write, and do math, that was it, the 3 R's. I was taught almost nothing beyond that, which is fine, but I learned on my own, through reading a whole bunch of stuff and using my mind to some extent, even though my own ability to freely think was quite hobbled by growing up in a mind control cult, right? Which, for its own, to suit its own purposes, actually hobbled my own ability to think for myself. But then that granted me the opportunity to teach myself logic and reason in my 30s, which is part of the reason I'm so fucking good at it. And yes, it ain't bragging if you can back it up, where I come from. And then what would MAGA say? What would traditional family values Christians say? Well, don't they honor above all the ways of their ancestors and the ways that they were raised, right? Isn't that honored above all the old ways? Well, to me, the old ways was part of that. Was it ain't, if I'm rootin' tootin' and I can, if I can show and prove what I'm claiming here, then I'm not bragging. I'm telling you what I'm capable of, right? I'm telling you what I can do. That ain't bragging. If the fella, the first time he came through the door and said he made 13 3-pointers, and he would even claim to catalog how many he made and how many he missed, it'd be like, all right, man, let's go there tomorrow, and I want to see if you can do this or not, right? That has to be on the table. So, and none of this is resolvable. I'm not able to resolve any of this, right? Benton is not the resolver of this, and it's always, the spiritual attack is always aimed at, can Benton be made to internalize this or these spiritual attacks? Can we authoritarian, in an authoritarian fashion, can he be forced, right, or coerced or compelled to accept the internalization of these spiritual attacks? And I'm here to tell you, no, I cannot. Will I fall away from proper identification for a few moments, and then the attacks will seemingly bear fruit? Yeah, absolutely. And then it's right back to proper identification, where no weapon formed against me can prosper, right? It's simply impossible. Yeah. How about that? What y'all think about that? Shout out to the chat. Please hit the like if you're so inclined. Much appreciated. Yeah, I don't achieve this very often, but it's my goal to have the juice of a lemon or a lime every day for the vitamin C, the electrolytes. It's helpful in the digestion. However, I'm finding that if I do that first thing in the morning, which I did this morning, and then I have my egg drink, which is high in fat, the combination of the fruit juice and the fat, it causes me to need to use the restroom when I may not have needed to otherwise. So that's where old Benton's at. But it's feeling like it's not going to be a necessity that occur, the trip to the restroom. I mean, some point in the day, just doesn't have to be right now. Which is one of the great gifts of not eating the goy slop. Because if my intestines were already used to dealing with a bunch of highly processed foods, or super high, what do they call these, super highly processed foods, or very highly processed foods? I think it's just highly processed foods. I would have already had to run to the bathroom. by now, certainly. Uh, so I feel like it can be ridden out. We'll see. We'll see. Oh, anyways. So yeah, um, feeling good about it. Not that that matters. And definitely am thankful and grateful for the opportunity to get all of that off my chest. Um, with a minimum of getting angry. And the old Benton would have gotten angry several times and yelled and hooped and hollered. And now apparently, now there was some story being read on this other channel, so maybe it was in the context of the story, but I saw some ridiculing of the notion of calming down or being calm, right? And I felt like that was directed towards me because I'm quite the opposite over time. I don't know that calm would typically be used to describe Benton. Um, and what I would say to that is, well, I thought stoicism was something to be admired. Now, I don't personally never subscribed to stoicism and don't find it admirable. It was just I was under the impression that the so-called truth community had internalized notions around stoicism, and wouldn't that involve, cultivating an ability to remain calm when the shit's hitting the fan or whatever, and to not be reactive. Well, what we know is the ridiculers and the gaslighters, and we see this with another channel called Jack Talcott. Well, they get a lot of mileage out of the Jack Talcotts and others, and I'm sure I fit into this group in the past of them being for the troll, and they're not trolls, but for the trolling to be able to be effective and to bear fruit, right? For there to be a stimulus and a response. And what we're finding is when properly identified, Benton is calm when properly identified, period. So when I talk about I've experienced way less anxiety, guilt, shame, fear, all negative states of being, I was not experiencing that much of them, but certainly was experiencing it to some extent, uh, and sometimes to a greater extent, as evidenced on a lot of these past live streams where I was quite emotional, right? Prone to excessive emotionalism would probably be the best way to put it. But surprise, surprise, working over time within my own energy sphere, power center, sphere of influence, through various practices, over time, I was able to get more and more control over all of that. But what is control? Control is assertion, aggression, and dominance. That's, again, the very Western or American notion of anything achievable is only achievable through a yang or an aggressive, assertive, dominant means, right? And that was kind of the fake it till you make it in some way, but at least to be more effective in the real world in my own interactions with people. And I knew part of me spending so much time hosting panels and going on other people's panels was I realized how easily triggered I was when I tried to have a panel or go on a panel or even watch a panel. And then I also recognized, okay, I must be lacking something because other people are able to do these things and not have quite the strong reactions. So a lot of my past time paneling, StreamYard panels, was me realizing that, oh, I'm not very good at this. And now here's an opportunity to, maybe move towards a mastery. Not that I certainly don't claim mastery of it, but my ability to do that, it became far greater, right? And and I think there was a lot of confusion years ago because I would be hosting a panel with full capabilities to mute people and backstage people, and even at times operate the audio equipment where I could turn down other people's audio and have mine be louder, right? Even beyond what StreamYard would allow. Um, and but that part of the neurodivergence is even in a telephone call with one other person, it's very difficult for me to know when is it my turn to talk, right? And so then we get into the shouting other people down, right? and how much energy was I willing to put into mixing it up and yelling at people. And yeah, for a time, quite a bit. And look at the time, look at what was going on in my life at the time. It was, sick as a dog every single day for 2 straight years. And even before that, drinking heavily and, clearly not in a good place overall. Right. And then to look at where I am now, well, again, this indefensible society, right? The vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions only measures in money, power, and what is Benton's lot in life. What access to resources does Benton have? Where does Benton lay his head at night? Does he bathe regularly? Right? All of these things, you know, as if to meet all of those metrics while lacking the spiritual side has any merit whatsoever, which brings us to the point of like, what is the profit for a man to gain the whole world and to lose his soul? Meaning, to check all of the boxes that this realm says should be. In fact, praise and acceptance is withheld until the person meets a certain level of hygiene, until they meet a certain level of access to resources, until they meet a certain level of where they lay their head at night. And again, probably somewhat in the vein of Fight Club and the notion of to allow that which does not matter to truly slide, right? What is the relevance of those things in the context of my own progression, mind, body, and spirit? They have no relevance except as advances Benton towards Benton's goal, right? The foremost of which is to follow the teachings of Christ Jesus as outlined in the Gospels of the Holy Bible, the King James Version in the English language, right? That's been my goal for quite some time. Because I'm here, I'm a goal-oriented type of person. I need something to work towards. That sounds as good as anything else. Actually, it sounds better than anything else, right? And then spending the time while homeless, while vagabonding around the country, while living my life to the outside naked eye in a way that is not acceptable socially at a status quo in a social contract, and actually using that to facilitate the reckoning with my own internal space, to spiritually reckon with and to comprehend and understand, okay, well, every man hath not the same office. My function is not your function, vice versa. And then okay, what is my purpose here? Well, it's to be of service. Okay, well, I don't want to be of service. Well, who cares what you want? All you asked was, what is your function? Okay. All right, then I guess off we go to figure out how to be of service. But to recognize, not to be of service to the vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of business transactions, not in service of that, because to be in service of that is to be in service of death. It's not to be in service of death, right? So a lot of that is to understand, okay, what to not be in service of, and then eventually recognizing, okay, my every thought, my every action for the entirety of this experience as Benton either serves life itself or serves death, and there's no middle ground. And to serve what this system of things upholds is to serve death and destruction, right? And now we're back to my critique and characterization of the people who find reason to ridicule and mock a lot of what, or at least some of what's talked about here, right? Their motivations is to continue to do what they've done their entire life, which is continue to serve and support and define themselves in relation to this vacuous, delusory, adversarial realm of death, destruction, depravity, power, business transactions. And what I am within myself is aligned with the highest power possible in the name of the Lord Christ Jesus within myself. The kingdom of God is within me style. God is love style. And anybody thinks they can come against those forces, I'd love to see you try. Demons, do your worst. Thanks for watching. Bye.